Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of Bite Size the Destroyer of Worlds. This has taken forever and I'm very sorry about that. There's just been a lot of things, obviously occurring within my life and this thing had to get pushed back. Either because I didn't want to do it or I just didn't feel like it was right. I had done a couple shoots of this before, like over the course of the month, and sometimes it just didn't feel right, and I was just trying to find a way to make it as best as possible. But finally I just came to the consensus that I should just basically just shoot for maybe a little bit more of a discussion rather than just a full out, alright, let me read this bullet point and this thing and this thing. I wanted to make it a little bit more natural and for it to have a flow, kind of like how in the last episode it was. So I've come down to this, and I think it turned out really well, so I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did making it, even though it definitely did take a while. A lot of effort was put into this, and I hope you guys can recognize that, and I'm very sorry for it taking forever. But yeah, here it is. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Early in 1939, the world scientific community discovered that German physicists had learned the secrets of splitting a uranium atom. Fear soon spread over the possibility of the Nazis being able to utilize this energy and produce a bomb capable of unspeakable destruction. Now let's kind of set the world stage here. This is in early 1939. We're basically in the beginning of the Second World War. It's just sparked, and this is a huge threat. If the Nazis are able to get the power of the uranium atom, if they can split it and produce, as we all know, the atomic bomb and any other bombs even more powerful than that, it could basically change the course of world history as we know it. The entire war could have gone a completely separate way if the world scientific community hadn't gone out and tried to inform the rest of the world on what we could do to stop this, and that we need to have the capability of producing a bomb before they do. So that's kind of setting the stage here, and that's why this is, putting the entire world on edge, because if they do get this, it could change the entire war. And this is still in the beginning, mind you that, so they have time to do this. Anyways, scientist Albert Einstein, who had fled Nazi prosecution, and Enrico Fermi, who had escaped fascist Italy, were now living in the United States. They agreed that the president must be informed of the dangers of atomic technology in the hands of the Axis powers, which, if you don't know, Axis powers would be referring to the Nazis and their allies. Einstein penned a letter to President Roosevelt urging the development of an atomic research program later that year. President Roosevelt didn't see this as a necessity, but he agreed to move forward slowly. Now, let's just imagine something alternate here. Let's say he just didn't find any necessity in it whatsoever. Not even that he wasn't, not that he's even slightly interested, just not at all. He says, now we're not going to do this. Think about how much different world history would be right now if Roosevelt had said something different. Think about that. That would be really interesting. Just a little thought out there. Anyway, so after this, President Roosevelt did see that necessity, and he, began to move forward slowly. So in late 1941, the American effort to design and build an atomic bomb received its code name, the Manhattan Project. After further progression was made, more funding was given to the project. Nuclear facilities were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. The main assembly plant was built in Los Alamos, New Mexico. After the final bill was tallied, nearly $2 billion had been spent on research and development of the atomic bomb. So now it's really gaining some speed, and just to give you an idea, $2 billion at this time period, that's worth a ton of money, okay? As of right now, that would be worth at least $27 billion. Just to give you an idea of how much money they're putting into this. That's astronomical. Now they're really starting to get into it. They're starting to see the necessity of it. Another interesting fact is that the Manhattan Project employed over 120,000 Americans. It created a lot of new jobs for people. Now before we move forward, let's just talk about how secret this project was. Neither the Germans nor the Japanese could learn of this project. Obviously. In fact, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill being the Prime Minister of Great Britain during this time, they agreed that they would keep Stalin in the dark. They didn't even tell him about this. So at this time, this needs a little bit of explanation for anyone who doesn't know. There was, of course, the allies, the big three allies that were fighting against the Nazis, basically the Axis powers, were the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. These are the big guys here, alright? So, they decided, both Winston Churchill and, of course, President Roosevelt, that they weren't going to let Stalin know about this. And there are a couple things, this kind of foreshadows a little bit on what the Cold War is going to look like. They already know that Stalin's absolutely crazy. Anyone who knew, that was working on the Allied side, anyone across the world knew that Stalin was crazy. So, they decided that it would probably be the best idea not to let him know about this, because even at this time, people would assume that that they knew after the Nazis were defeated that the Soviet Union would be the next problem. Obviously, because there were already ideological differences within the Allies between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as Great Britain and the Soviet Union, because of course, you know, how their governments function. Really, everything since the Soviet Union was established back in the 1910s, it kind of set them on edge, and they were always kind of looking at each other with a little bit of some bad light. So that gives you an idea of just how the tensions are rising there, even before, well, really even like in the midst of World War II. Anyway, sorry I took a moment to talk about that. But consequently, there was no public awareness or debate. Keeping 120,000 people quiet would be impossible. Therefore, only a very small privileged cadre of inner scientists and officials knew about the atomic bomb's development. So people even working on the project didn't even know what they were actually working towards. They're kind of being kept in the dark about this as well. This has to be kept very secret, because you're not going to keep 120,000 people's mouths shut, correct? And not only were they keeping it away from 120,000 people, the vice president at the time, Harry Truman, another name that will be very important later in the story, had never heard of the Manhattan Project until he became President Truman. Of course, because he had to use the atomic bombs on Japan when he was president. But there was one slight infiltration of this secret that occurred when a Soviet spy learned about the project, but by then it was already far too late. So in 1945, after 3 years of research and experimentation, the world's first nuclear device, dubbed Gadget, was successfully detonated in New Mexico. Gadget was shaped like a large steel egg, and like Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, it was a plutonium implosion device. Now before the test, the stakes were incredibly high. In fact, now, President Harry Truman, remember we're in 1945 now, we kind of jumped forward a couple years, he had to delay his meeting with Soviet and British leaders at the Potsdam Conference, where they gathered to decide how to administer the defeated Nazi Germany. So remember, now that we jump forward a couple years in time, Nazi Germany has been defeated. The Japanese are still, of course, running wild in the Pacific, so this just kind of gives you an idea of how the world looks now, when the Manhattan Project is kind of coming to a close here. Nazi Germany had agreed to unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on May 8th. And he delayed this meeting until he knew the results of the Trinity test, just giving you an idea of how high the stakes are here, how much people are putting on the line, how badly they want this to be successful. Because the Trinity test would have a great impact on his strategy for ending the war with Japan, and my god, it did. So with all this tension and people working on the project, having their doubts and how it would even work, after many delays due to weather, on July 16th, Gadget was dropped from an 100-foot metal tower and detonated with between 15 to 20 kilotons of force, slightly more than the little boy dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion annihilated nearly all of the 100-foot metal tower from which the bomb was dropped from, and created a crater of radioactive green glassy substance known as trininite. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but that's just how it looks. I'll have the word up on the screen. Which is today collected as a prized collector's item. Radiation levels at the site remain about 10 times as high as the natural background radiation. The atomic age had begun. After years of difficult work, everything finally went according to plan. The test actually yielded more kilotons of TNT than it was predicted to. The complex array of cables, wires, switches, and detonators all worked in unison to create an explosion of energy unlike anything the world had ever seen. Now, even though this happened, and of this huge explosion, the success of the Trinity test was initially limited to those in the Manhattan Project scientists who had already had the knowledge of the atomic bomb. Remember, people are still being kept inside the dark about this. despite the fact that the explosion was felt in cities throughout the state. Now that gives you an idea of just how large this explosion is. It's able to be felt across the state in multiple different cities. In fact, because these people, the United States citizens, still have to be kept in the dark about this, so officially, the cause was reported as an accidental detonation of a bunker containing a number of high explosives and pyrotechnics. Only after the atomic bombings of Japan was Trinity's true nature made known. After the explosion, there was much celebration, many from relief, but it should be said that it wasn't all happy fun times. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the main leaders of the Manhattan Project, and the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during the Manhattan Project, uttered after witnessing the test,
I remembered
the line from the Hindu
line
scripture,
from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
I wonder what he would think of the other bombs that are about to come in the future, about the ones that would be so huge, far, like hundreds of times bigger than the bomb that he just witnessed. How would he react to those? Now, you might have also noticed the Destroyer of Worlds. Ever wondered where the series gets its title? Well, that's where it comes from. Leo Szilard, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, a Hungarian-American physicist, had long held strong moral objections to the use of the atomic bomb. It was the reason that, despite his early contributions to nuclear physics and the project Grove sought to limit his role, now that the world has gotten its first taste of the use of these weapons, Szilard was disturbed. He did not want to see the weapon used in combat, so he drafted a petition for President Truman demanding that the Japanese be warned before the atomic bomb was used on them. His petition was signed by dozens of employees at the Chicago Metallurgic Lab and at the Oak Ridge project site. The petition never made it to the President Truman, and Szilard and several of his petition signatories were criticized by Groves and others. So despite all the negative feelings that came out of this event, and even though there were some pushes to have this not being used in combat, it still got put through. But multiple voices still spoke out even after the weapons were used and the war had ended. And one of them being one of the most famous scientists of all time that we've already mentioned, Albert Einstein. At the end of the war, Einstein spoke out against the nuclear strikes on Japan, arguing that they were unjustified and motivated by US-Soviet politicking. With the benefit of hindsight, he regretted having urged an atomic weapons program in the US. And I think that just shows you how much he actually cared about this. He completely regrets even giving the United States the idea to even start doing this. And it should be mentioned that he really didn't participate as much in the Manhattan Project as it seems like a lot of people believe. He was more kind of, getting the engine started and allowed it to roll, but he didn't participate a ton in it. He kind of gave, he helped with the scientific knowledge of it and the ideas, but he really didn't participate in the making. So as he said, "I do not consider myself the father of the release of atomic energy. My part in it was quite indirect. I did not, in fact, foresee that it would be released in my time. I believed only that it was theoretically possible. It became practical through the accidental discovery of chain reaction. And this was not something I could have predicted." And I think that also just goes to show how quickly scientific innovation moves forward today and even in the 50s. He didn't even expect this thing to go through, but I also think it really shows that when the government steps in, or I should just say people with money, and people unite against one common cause, things can get done a lot quicker than we expect them to. And Einstein, of course, didn't see that happening until everyone jumped on board and, look where it was. He wasn't even expecting it to happen within his own lifetime, which, by the way, at this point in time was quite close to ending, as we'll mention later. Following the war, Einstein gave strong support to organizations fighting against militarism and atomic weapons in particular. In May 1946, he became the chair of a newly formed emergency committee of atomic scientists, which was primarily concerned with education on the dangers of atomic weapons. Funds raised by the committee assisted other organizations, such as the Federation of American Scientists, and activities like the publication of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In 1955, scientist-philosopher Bertrand Russell approached Einstein, suggesting that the group of scientists be convened to discuss nuclear disarmament and ways in which war could be abolished. The first such meeting was held in July 1957 in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. Shortly before his death in 1955, Einstein was one of 11 scientists to sign an initial statement, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. This manifesto calling for an abolishment of not only atomic weapons, but also of war itself, regardless of the necessary, distasteful limitations of national sovereignty. Now that first one being hard to complete itself, but not only that, the second one being nearly impossible, asking for war to end. That's quite, a big ask of the human race, right? That's to ask a ton. To put down something that we have done ever since we started walking on our two legs, and even before that. So that one was a little bit far shot, but you can also see what he's trying to get done there. Einstein understands, like many other scientists at this time, that if atomic weapons are used in any war in the future, the effects would be devastating. The war would not have a clear winner. Everyone would be destroyed. And that is commonly known as mutually assured destruction. Now, if we're to focus off that point, let's talk about the first point that he makes, getting rid of atomic weapons in general. That's also a very hard task to complete, especially when you give this power to a nation, the only one to have it at the moment, the United States, and say, please, take it away, we're going to take it away, we're not going to use it. That's a ton to ask. The United States now is, let's put it in their perspective, right? The United States now has a power that no other nation in history has ever had. They have the high ground militarily over everyone. No government's going to put that away. Not even today, as we've seen. But we'll get into that in the third episode. For Einstein, the issue of atomic weapons was subordinate to the broader issue of militarism and nationalism. He wrote, "As long as there are sovereign nations possessing great power, war is inevitable. That is not an attempt to say when it will come, but only that it is sure to come. That was true before the atomic bomb was made. What has changed is the destructiveness of war." As I was saying earlier, he's recognizing that if another conflict were to occur, atomic weapons would completely change how conflicts would play out, and just the effects of them altogether, as he's showing in that quote. In 1950, Einstein appeared on the NBC network program called Today with Miss Roosevelt, discussing the US government's plans to build hydrogen bombs far more powerful than the fission bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Einstein's speech on the NBC program was typically punchy, warning that the idea of achieving security through national armament was a disastrous illusion. The arms race between the US and the Soviet Union had assumed a hysterical character, and that with the advent of hydrogen bombs, radioactive poisoning of the atmosphere and hence annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities, as we said, mutually assured destruction. His comments on the NBC program attracted not only newspaper headlines, but also the attention of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who promptly issued a memo to the FBI offices across the country seeking all available derogatory information on Einstein. But Albert died on April 18th of 1955. Just to give you an idea of how serious they want to keep this to themselves, they don't want any negative press on this thing, alright? They want to keep this. They don't want anyone telling them to take it away, correct? So they're going after Einstein. They're trying to find derogatory information on him. Anything that makes him look bad so people won't take his word to any knowledge of their own, correct? So that just kind of gives you an idea, as I was saying earlier, of just how badly they want to keep this. So that's where I'm going to end today's episode, because I just want to save what I was thinking about talking in this episode for later, because now we're going to go into the history of atomic weaponry, like what's going to happen after the creation, because we've already talked about what happened with the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now we've talked about the creation with them and all the negative pushback that came with it, and as well as the positive reactions. And now I want to go dive into the history in the next episode, and I think that this is a little bit of a good place to end here. So yeah, I also want to say, this is just something on Albert Einstein. He's just one of, the most amazing people to, ever have lived. This episode, I mean, after doing research for this episode and kind of going off into different tangents on what he had done throughout his life, I just gained a ton more respect for him than I used to have. Of course, I always, showed respect to him. I had never had any animosity against him, towards him, I should say. But it really kind of just cemented it for me, just how an amazing person, all the things he'd done, and his views on just the world, just entirely the great things he had done just for the United States and the world as a whole, and how he also just viewed these, because he had lived in a time, in Germany, and he had grown up in this time of nationalism through World War I and World War II, and he just noticed all the negative effects of it, right? He lived throughout Europe in that time, and just he noticed, all the problems that the Third Reich had, right? And all the things that were just wrong with European nationalism as a whole, and all the negative things that comes with it, as well as hatred and animosity towards different religions, but also his views on human nature, and religion as a whole. He has some very cool views on that, that I agree with at the same time. I think some of them are a little bit different, but you should go look for yourself. It's amazing. Just learn more about him. I didn't know nearly as much about him until I did research for this episode. So yeah, amazing guy. Sorry, I kind of went off in a tangent there, but I hope you enjoyed. I really liked making this episode. I'm so sorry it took a while to come out. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next bite-sized The Destroyer of Worlds.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.